My name is Pat Kelly. I'm a Jesuit. I teach at Seattle University. And last fall, I was fortunate to attend the conference at the Vatican called Sport at the Service of Humanity. It was a remarkable gathering, a real worldwide, global gathering, and interreligious people from many religious traditions were represented. What I want to do in this talk is to talk about some of the main themes of the conference and then reflect on their relevance for our own context, especially with regard to youth sport, what all of us are working in. So just the first day itself was really kind of a whirlwind of activity. Pope Francis came and spoke. Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General, spoke. There's a picture of him in the upper right-hand corner there. You can see all the people from different religious traditions sitting there. The Archbishop of Canterbury is on the far right. Thomas Bach, the president of the International Olympic Committee, spoke. And then we were treated to dance and music from many different cultures. So you see the dancers there in the bottom right. After that, we went to the Sistine Chapel and got a tour, a description of all the art in the chapel by the director of the Vatican Museum. And then we had a piano concerto by Lang Lang in the Vatican Gardens there, and we had dinner that night in the Vatican Museums, as we did another night as well. One of the things that I was reflecting on after that day was that this particular faith tradition, Catholicism, at its best moments, embraces what is human, especially the art, the dance, the music, the art in the Vatican museums. There are counterexamples too, right, of Catholic Church not maybe embracing some aspects of culture or some cultures. But at its best moments, I think it embraces what is human and accepts aspects of culture. The way of thinking about this would be that God's grace doesn't diminish or need to remove what is human, right? But God's grace perfects, raises to a whole other level what is human already. What Irenaeus in the 2nd century said, the glory of God is a human being fully alive. No? The same approach, I think, has been taken with respect to play and sport historically. I think that's the mainstream approach in this particular tradition. If you think of the medieval period, there were 130-some feast days during the medieval period, typically, give or take some, depending on the exact time period or place. But there were that many feast days, and people participated in play and sport on the feast days of the church year. They're also depicted in religious art. This is a stained glass window from Gloucester Cathedral from 1350. This is also from Gloucester Cathedral. Mercy seat for the monks who would be praying the hours. Here's a prayer book from France around 1300 with depictions of ball games in the margins. This is very common in the prayer books of this period. This is the same prayer book here. All of this, I think, tells us that for Christians at this time, participating in play and sport wasn't contradictory to their faith, understanding of faith. It happened on feast days, religious holy days, depicted in religious works of art. But there was also an intellectual underpinning to all of this, and Thomas Aquinas plays a very important role here. He asked the question in his Summa Theologica, can there be a virtue about games? And he answers yes. And the reason that he gives is that virtue, he's following Aristotle here, virtue has to do with moderation. And so therefore, you shouldn't be working all the time. This would be excessive. This would not be moderate. He quotes Augustine here in the beginning of his response. I pray, spare yourself at times, for it becomes a wise person sometimes to relax the high pressure of his attention to work. And this relaxation of the mind comes in play. Therefore, it becomes a wise and virtuous person to have recourse to such things at times. So Thomas Aquinas was really influential on late medieval preachers when it came to dealing with this subject, that it was good to have time for play and recreation was something that would be coming through in the homilies of the time. But I think it's important to point out that for Thomas, play doesn't have its significance in relation to work, as though it's the pause that refreshes in order to get back to what's really important, work, and to be more productive. No, he insisted it has its own meaning. It's what he called autotelic, that we do it for its own sake. And yet, while we do it for its own sake, he says it does have an end, but the end is the human person. The pleasure and enjoyment derived from play, he says, is directed to the recreation of the human person. So it serves the human person. This is actually the title of the conference that we had in Rome, Sport at the Service of Humanity. This way of thinking about play influenced the humanists who ran the schools in the Renaissance period, the early Jesuits. Both of those groups included time for play and sport in the daily lives and experiences of the students. It's also what influenced Catholics when they came to the United States, this way of thinking. And right from the start, Catholic schools incorporated play and sport as part of the school days. So this theme of sport as play came through in the conference. This is from the opening talk from Cardinal Ravasi, who's the president of the Pontifical Council for Culture, who sponsored this conference. Cardinal Ravasi says, in fact, sport is the living and dynamic expression of a fundamental category of the human person, play. That is, the free expression of one's own creativity and potential, both physical and spiritual. Of course, sport also teaches life lessons, so it's maybe a unique phenomenon in this way. We do it for its own sake, and yet it has all of these kind of benefits that we've been talking about at the conference, including, for example, becoming aware that you're part of something larger than yourself, say if you're playing on a team. So if we think of sport then, in today's terms, a lot of philosophers will use the phrase a human good. If we think of sport as a human good, which I think is the way this tradition approaches it, then justice requires that all who want to participate in it should have the opportunity to do so because it's related to human well-being and flourishing. And at the conference, we focused on children and others who are living in poverty or displaced persons, refugees, girls and young women, and persons with disabilities. And where we're reflecting on how we could go about making sure that sport is available to persons in these kinds of circumstances or situations. There was a nice story told by one of the aid workers. She came to a football pitch in Rwanda. This picture is from Rwanda. And she came a little late to the game. And so she asked one of the boys, who's winning? And he said, we're all winning because we have a pitch to play on now. I thought it was a kind of a touching response from the young man. So we heard from the founder of the Paralympics, Sir Philip Craven. His picture's on the left here. Also from Mel Young, who founded the Homeless World Cup in the early 2000s. We heard from Special Olympian Loretta Claiborne. During the course of her talk, she said, God is my strength and Special Olympics is my joy. Timothy Shriver is the founder, or the person who's the head of Special Olympics now. And he made the point that, we often, when we're thinking of sport, we also often tend to think, am I the best? But he was encouraging us instead to think, am I my best? Or kind of encouraging us to think, does sport provide an opportunity for all persons who want to participate to be their best, to flourish as human beings? This is a picture of Paul Lekoro, who's a South Sudan refugee who was at the conference, and he was on the refugee team at the Olympics, this past Olympics. Stephan Jacques of the United Nations High Commission on Refugees office spoke a little bit about sports in the refugees context. He said that one of the bad habits often practiced by development groups is that they appeal for help to assist refugees instead of providing an environment in which refugees can be secure and address their own issues. He pointed out that displaced persons need support in addressing three fundamental needs: to belong, to connect, and to develop a new sense of personal and social identity. And he said that sport can assist displaced people as they address these needs, because sport creates a familiar environment in which individuals feel that they belong. It allows connections to those with whom and against whom we play, and it helps them to develop a strong sense of self-identity with this growing social cohesion. Another theme that was emphasized was building bridges. This is taken from Thomas Bach, the president of the IOC's opening talk. He's quoting Pope Francis in the beginning. Sport is a universal language which surpasses borders, languages, races, religions, and ideologies. It has the capacity to bring people together, encouraging dialogue and acceptance. And then Thomas Bach goes on to say in his own words, in our fragile world today, shaken by conflicts, crises, and mistrust, the message that our shared humanity is stronger than the forces that want to divide us is more relevant than ever. And then Cardinal Ravasi reiterated this theme in his closing talk. All those engaged in sports must become models to create bridges over the valleys of ethnic division, of social cultural separation, of ideological opposition. Their mission could be portrayed with a suggestive Muslim tradition. It imagines that God created angels so that, spreading their wings, they become a bridge between the banks of the rivers and the valleys which divide countries and peoples. So then some reflections on our own experiences in the United States. I think, first of all, we've done very well, I mentioned this earlier, with regard to accepting sport. You see this in Catholic schools in the United States. I'm now talking about in the Catholic context. You see it in Catholic schools right from the very start. This is a description of a doctor who was on his way from Detroit to Chicago and stopped by South Bend and saw a scene in 1850 that filled him with admiration. Playgrounds and children playing and swimming and gymnastics apparatus, etc. So even before, the rise of big-time athletics here at Notre Dame, right from the start, students had time to play and to participate in sport. This is my own research indicates that this is true in all the Catholic schools I've looked at. I've certainly studied the Jesuit schools very closely. Same thing is going on at Jesuit schools, same thing at other Catholic schools, right from the start. And then we also have the Catholic Youth Organization, founded by Bishop Shiel in 1930. And Timothy Neary spoke here in February, I think, at Notre Dame. And in his new book, Crossing Boundaries, we learn a lot about Bishop Shiel, right from the start in 1930. Children of all ethnic and racial backgrounds and all economic classes were included in the activities and the sports of the Catholic Youth Organization, and boys and girls. So he's really a model, I think, for us of inclusion and also building bridges. This headline from 1935 says about the CYO, all races and nations participate in the CYO program. And then they had a picture below of boxers who came from places like Croatia, Austria, Poland, Ireland, China, Italy, African-American boxers, Mexican young people. So I think a real inspiration for us. You know, one of the things I think that is important, especially in the United States context, is this notion or this experience of being on a team. I think one of the human goods of sport is that we do learn that we're a part of something larger than ourselves. It sort of introduces us to community, introduces young people to community, maybe to the common good. There's a book by Alan Gutman, who's a very well-known historian of sport, and the last chapter is called Individualism Reconsidered. And he points out that in the United States, a country that's often criticized for being individualistic, it is interesting that the most popular sports are team sports. He mentions football, basketball, and baseball. It's interesting to think about. No? And I kind of wonder, do sports in our particular context play a function that has to do with community and how, you know, and bringing people together? That could be an important resource to draw on in our time when there are so many things that are dividing people, whether it has to do with politics or race or religious belief. And yet, while that can be a great resource, and Bishop Shields certainly used it in that way, we still have tensions, racial tensions in our own time. I'm just going to read a short paragraph from Timothy Neary's talk when he was here at Notre Dame. He describes the controversy that's written about in this New York Times article. A controversy during the summer of 2001 painfully exposed the limits of Catholic youth sports to bridge racial divides in the Chicago metropolitan area. Parents representing parishes in the mostly white Southside Catholic Conference voted 11-9 to refuse admission to St. Sabina, an African-American parish in the Auburn-Gresham neighborhood on the city's southwest side. The story made front-page headlines. Cardinal Francis George intervened, and the black parish was accepted into the SCC following a revote. After 6 months in the league, however, St. Sabina dropped out, citing incidents of racial harassment. Unsuccessful in their attempt to play in a Catholic sports league, the African-American Catholic school instead joined the Chicago Public League. Despite Cardinal George's directive to let the kids play, Catholic interracial sports remained unachievable. Maybe some of you have heard about Cardinal Cupich, the relatively new cardinal in Chicago, his new initiatives for the Archdiocese. He came out and gave a speech about this. There was a letter from Pope Francis supporting him and these initiatives. And they have to do with reorienting the resources and the personnel of the Archdiocese of Chicago to address issues of violence, poverty, and racism in the diocese. And in his talk and in the stories that covered it, the CYO is explicitly mentioned as an organization that can be of assistance in this regard. Here's a story about Maryville CYO and St. Martin de Porres working together to provide opportunities for young African-American kids and other children to participate in athletics, which took place last summer. This story, I'll just read a little bit of it. On May 1st, Chicago Archbishop Cupich celebrated a unity mass at St. Martin de Porres Church on the city's west side. Cupich told the congregation that in the face of an escalating number of shootings and gun-related homicides, new opportunities are needed to fight, quote, the hopelessness in the hearts of our youth. Maryville and its CYO program partnered with the St. Martin de Porres Parish this summer to offer a 6-week basketball program for West Side children. So maybe just something to think about and to consider, an example of maybe how sport could be used in our context to build bridges. So a concern that I would have. The conference was called Sport at the Service of Humanity, and I mentioned how Thomas Aquinas thinks play leads to the flourishing of the human person. I'm wondering if in some ways in our time youth sport ends up being seen as a means to money and fame. Even money could be college scholarships, simple as that, rather than that it serves the human person or the common good. You can order these DVDs for yourself if you want. Athleticbaby.com, perfect for the dad who already envisions his newborn playing in the US Open one day. You know? I actually have one of these, and it's just babies rolling around on the floor with a golf ball, and so baby goes pro. You know? Never too early to start developing athletic talent. The means to end thinking, especially, usually it takes place with regard to college scholarships, that participation in youth sports is going to be a means to get my child to college scholarship, or it could be professional contract for more ambitious families. What happens is that parents and coaches encourage kids to specialize in one sport now, very early, thinking that will get them a leg up on other young people. But the problem is their bodies can't take the year-round training, and we're having a dramatic rise in overuse injuries in youth sport. The other thing I would say is that the joy, and if the play element has to do with doing something for its own sake, the enjoyment, this dynamic interferes with that, because it's not doing it for its own sake, it's for some other purpose outside of the activity. I think sometimes club teams complicate this situation, especially if the persons running the club teams need the revenue, and so they end up running year-long programs where kids are participating all year long. By the way, I won't cite the scholarship right now, but there's evidence that actually participating in many sports is better and leads to high-level elite performance. There are academic articles that have been published in that regard. Steph Curry would be an anecdotal kind of example. You know, he played all football, baseball, soccer, all the sports when he was younger. I don't know if people have seen the film Hoop Dreams. It's a wonderful film. I highly recommend it. It's about two African-American young men growing up in the city of Chicago. They are recruited to play basketball at St. Joseph's Catholic High School outside of Chicago. This little clip features William Gates. He's a really phenomenal player at St. Joseph's, and he's at the Nike camp. So just keep in mind what I was talking about. Sport is a means to some other end, or there are other dynamics starting to influence. This is the Marquette basketball coach.
Recruiting is like any other sales business. We've got to win to keep our jobs. We've got to fill the arena to keep our jobs. And if we don't, they fire us. I mean, that's hey, bankers don't make money, they fire them.
When you look at some of these young boys' bodies, they got NBA bodies already.
These are college coaches watching the young kids coming in.
One particular kid who's here now, I've watched them since 6th grade, and I've watched them blossom.
Because that's when you want to get on them when they're young, and start writing them before everybody else writes them. Try to get any edge you can in this business.
It's already become a meat market, but I try to do my job, as, you know, and serve professional meat.
What schools do you think are most involved with William right now?
I would say DePaul, Marquette.
I have a concern that this title of this film is Hoop Dreams, and one of my concerns is that we put so much emphasis on sport as something that's going to lead to upward mobility for young people, like William Gates, and making it professionally. But in fact, as I think we all know, the numbers of young people that make it professionally are so small. And it's kind of an individualistic sort of approach, because we tend to think, oh, if this young person made it, then he gets credit for having worked hard. If young people don't make it, they think, oh, it's just my fault. And I'm just wondering if there are some ways in which our attention is misdirected as a society, and that putting so much attention on sport, we don't pay attention to other issues having to do with justice in our society, poverty, relations between the races. I think the approach of Marysville and Martin DePores is more helpful, approach where we're taking care of one another, providing opportunities for young people to encounter one another and build up community together. This isn't to say, I teach in a university, I have a lot of our student athletes in the class. We don't want to, if a young person has the talent, et cetera, you don't want to stop them from dreaming and making it. But realistically, how do we serve the vast majority of the young people? Does it do them a service to keep fueling the hoop dreams if we're not looking at fundamental issues in our society? The very last line of this film, Hoop Dreams, is from William Gates, and he says the following: "When somebody says to me, 'When you make it to the NBA, don't forget about me,' I should say to them, 'Well, if I don't make it, don't you forget about me.'" I think that's something that is good to hear, for us to hear and to think about. So another issue would have to do with inclusion. It's an interesting situation we have, as some kids are training year-round in a very serious sort of way. Many other children are dropping out of youth sport. Now, Clark mentioned 70% by the time they're age 13 are dropping out. And the number one reason they give is no longer fun. So you have health problems with other children who aren't engaged in participating in sport. But these problems are, I think, related. In the book that I edited, Youth, Sport, and Spirituality, Nicole Lavoie points out that girls of color have some of the lowest participation rates in sports. This article is about how much participation in youth sport costs, and that young people sometimes are not participating because they don't come from families that have the money to participate. Here's a quote from somebody named Michael Sagas, who teaches at the University of Florida. He was just at the U.S. Youth Soccer National Championships. He says, "From a sport development perspective, I think we're in trouble." He said at the championships, the crowd was a sliver of the upper middle class, mostly upper middle class to wealthy. We're seeing the best of that group, but we're definitely not reaching the entire population. And there are statistics that I could share with you if you're interested in those as well. So at the conference, the people who put together the conference put together a preamble to their Declaration of Principles. And I thought the preamble captured well their commitments, their core commitments. And I've put in bold font, including this first one, the themes that I think we could do well to think about in the United States and maybe emphasize given some of our context. So the first one is, sport has the power to celebrate our common humanity, regardless of faith, race, culture, beliefs, gender, and ability. The second one, sport can bring us together to meet one another across borders and boundaries, to learn to compete as friends, to respect and trust one another, even in opposition. This one I think we already do well at, power to teach positive values and enrich lives. Here's another one maybe good for us to think about. Many people are deprived of sport through lack of opportunity, prejudice, or vested interest. We have a responsibility to help and share its benefits. And then these last two I think we do, I think even at conferences like these, we've been emphasizing these for some time. I'd like to just end with a personal story. I went to the conference from Nicaragua. I was teaching at the University of Central America in Nicaragua last fall. And my boss, Kenya, gave me a picture of her son, Ethan, this beautiful boy. And she asked me, Ethan has autism, and she asked me if I could take it because she thought I was going to be staying where the Pope stays, because that's what they told me initially, but then they bumped me. So she thought, well, this might be the closest that I can get to Pope Francis. And so I didn't stay there, but where the Pope stayed. But when he came in, I have the photo there, and I'm telling him in Spanish, "Este chico tiene el autismo." This boy has autism. And I want you to notice that Pope Francis is already past me. He's on his way up to the stage. The UN Secretary General is there. Thomas Bach is there. Leaders from all over the world of sport, some of the most successful people in the world of sport are there. He's going somewhere important. But he hears me say that. And he stops. And then he comes back. And he puts his hand on the photo. And he closes his eyes. And he prays for about 4 seconds. So I think that I'm wondering if maybe we're called to pivot with the Pope. Because after all, we're also are all on our way somewhere important, as the Pope was. And we're planning our programming, CYO, at our high schools. But maybe we're called to pivot with the Pope to those children who are left out, who are marginalized, who maybe don't have opportunities in society that we ourselves might have. To try to not only include them, but try to encounter them, learn from them. Let them change us. Let them help us to grow. Thank you.